Glory to you, O Lord.
Just then, a lawyer stood up to test Jesus and said, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" And I said to him, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your strength, and with all your soul, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself." Then he said to him, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he asked, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers, who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now it happened that a priest was going along that road, and when he saw him, he crossed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite came near to that place, and when he saw him, crossed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near to him, and when he saw him, he was filled with compassion. And he went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on wine and oil. He put him on his own animal and took him to an inn. The next day he took 2 denarii and said to the innkeeper, "Take care of him, and when I come back, I will repay whatever else you spent." Now I ask you, which of these 3 was a neighbor to the one who fell into the hands of robbers? He answered, "The one who showed him mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." This is the gospel of our Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
This text we hear today is so familiar, so common within and without of Christian circles that we have laws named after it. Good Samaritan laws that protect those who seek to help others. When something is this well known, it's hard to read it and perhaps harder to preach on it because we are certain we know what's going on. We know the whole story, we know all the characters, we know what they do, we know who we want to be and who we don't want to be in the story. But when we have decided that we know exactly what is going on, that is when we run the risk of making assumptions and thinking that we know more than we really do. Let's start with the fact that we call this story the Good Samaritan, but nowhere in the story is the word good used. The story, the parable that Jesus tells, is about how to be a neighbor. We are told that the Samaritan is filled with compassion. We are told that he shows mercy. We are told that he is neighborly. Perhaps it should be called the neighborly Samaritan, or the merciful Samaritan, or the compassionate Samaritan. But we have called it the Good Samaritan for so long that that's just what it is at this point. We assume that we know who is who and what they are doing and who we are in the story. We call him good, and so we want to be the Samaritan. We know for sure in this parable who we don't want to be. We certainly don't want to be the robbers, and we don't want to be the victim, the one who falls into the hands of robbers. And as soon as we get a little bit into the story, it's clear that we don't want to be the priest or the Levite, the ones who see and then pretend they haven't seen, cross to the other side and leave the man half dead by the side of the road. We know we're not supposed to be them, so we don't want to be them, and we say we are not them. And yet, we excuse their actions. Time and time again, we talk about all the many reasons why the priest and the Levite would have passed by. We talk about how they are important religious leaders. They are busy. They have things to do in Jerusalem. And if they go and touch this man, they will be unclean and unable to enter the temple. We excuse their actions even though the story doesn't tell us if they're going to Jericho or Jerusalem. We say it would be too dangerous for them to approach this man, for what if the robbers are still around? What if he himself is a robber simply pretending to be half dead? We excuse them walking by and pretending he is not there. And then if that isn't enough, we begin to blame the man who fell into the hands of robbers. We talk about how the road from Jerusalem to Jericho is very dangerous, and why was he traveling alone, and why wasn't he paying more attention? We forget that the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan are also traveling alone. And we blame the one who has been left half dead by the side of the road. If we know we don't want to be the priest and the Levite, why do we give them so many ways to be excused for their actions? Is it because somewhere deep inside we know how often we are the priest and the Levite? Is it because we know that many times we too see the person lying half dead by the side of the road and choose to unsee it, to cross on the other side and pretend we didn't know what was going on? If we can come up with excuses for the priest and the Levite, then certainly we ourselves can be excused. For we too are busy. We too are important. We too don't want to get dirty. We too are concerned about dangers to ourselves. We too will blame the victim lying in the road. We will be the ones who hear stories of children locked in cages and then turn away and pretend we haven't seen it, or blame them for what has happened to them. 3 years ago, when this text came around, we were in a national conversation about several black men who had died at the hands of police officers. And then, too, we were blaming the victims, or we were turning away and pretending we were not seeing what was happening before our very eyes, not seeing our neighbor lying half dead beside the road. Even now, on a regular basis, we pull up to a stoplight and we see someone holding a sign asking for food or money, and suddenly we are very busy making sure that the radio is tuned to just the right station. We see our neighbors half dead by the road, and then we pretend we haven't seen, and we cross by on the other side, and we excuse ourselves because we're busy and important, and it might be dangerous, and we don't know what they've done to deserve this place in life. We don't want to be the priest or the Levite. We know we're not supposed to be the priest and the Levite, and yet, time and time again, we find ourselves acting like them. And so it's no wonder that we come up with excuses for why they would act in this way, why they should be let off the hook for taking care of their neighbor. We know we want to be the Samaritan. We know that this is the whole point of the story, for at the end of it, Jesus says, be like him, go and do likewise. Be merciful and compassionate and neighborly to the one, even the stranger, lying half dead in the road. We know we want to be the Samaritan. And even in this, we're not quite ready to give up as much as the Samaritan does. For we are told in the story that he is traveling. He is on his way somewhere. He too is busy and important and has things to do. But he takes time. He takes a day out of his traveling because he is so filled with compassion for the one lying half dead beside the road. He uses his resources, his bandages, his wine, his oil, his animal. He spends 2 days' wages and promises anything more that is needed to take care of this man who he doesn't know, but feels compassion for anyway. We want to be the Samaritan. We want to be the good one, the neighborly one, the compassionate and merciful one, but it means making sacrifices. Sacrifices of time and resources and of money to take care of someone we might not even know. And I guess Jesus knew. I assume that he knew what the lawyer was up to. For the story tells us that the lawyer comes to test him. And when he gives the right answer, that's not quite enough, and so the lawyer tries to justify himself. Maybe he's trying to make excuses for the times when he was like the priest or the Levite. When he asks, "Who is my neighbor?" we can imagine that he's trying to draw the circle as small as possible. Certainly, Jesus will tell me it's my family and the 3 people on either side of my house. But Jesus, as he so often does, bursts the circle wide open. Our neighbors are not just those in close proximity to us, not just those who we already love, not even those we know. Our neighbors even include the stranger lying on the side of the road. And perhaps most surprisingly of all to the Jewish hearers of this story, our neighbor is the Samaritan, the enemy, the one that we hate, the one that we wish would just go away. The most surprising part of this story is that the enemy of the Jews is the one who is called neighborly, merciful, compassionate. And if he can be a neighbor, then we are called to be a neighbor of his as well. "Who is my neighbor?" asks the lawyer, trying to justify himself in pulling the circle closer and closer. And Jesus says, your neighbor is everyone you meet. The one lying half dead on the road, the ones who are too busy, the ones who make excuses, and your enemy who happens to be walking by. And Jesus asks the lawyer, which one of these was a neighbor? And the lawyer says, the one who was merciful. And Jesus says, go and do likewise. And he knows. He knows that probably more often than not, the lawyer will turn into the Levite or the priest, crossing on the other side of the road to avoid seeing what they have already seen. He knows that more often than not, we will do the same thing, and yet he calls anyway. Go and do likewise. Be compassionate and merciful. Care for your neighbor. And in the call, we hear a promise and a reminder. Because we have been the man lying half dead on the side of the road. We have been the one who has been rescued. Rescued not by the Samaritan, but by Jesus himself, who raised us from death into life, who filled us with love and compassion and mercy and grace, and then issues the call, go and do likewise. We are called to show compassion as we have been shown compassion. We are called to give mercy as we have been given mercy, called to pour grace on others as we have had grace poured on us. Jesus calls us to do this, knowing more often than not we're going to mess up. But then we'll pass another person half dead in the road. And maybe that time we will be filled with compassion. Maybe that time we will be willing to sacrifice our resources and our time on behalf of our neighbor, on behalf of our sibling, on behalf of this child of God, beloved and in need. Which of these three was a neighbor, Jesus asks. the one who showed him mercy. Go and do likewise.